territory. And so in the Northwest Ordinance in the 1780s, which was designed to organize that territory so that it could eventually become states, it states in the Northwest Ordinance that slavery will not be allowed in those territories. Okay? Of course, at that point, that was pretty much all of the unorganized territory in the United States. Because remember, the United States does not own what is now, Louisiana, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Nebraska, on up to Oregon. It doesn't own any of that. That was all part France, Spain's, and then France's. But then Thomas Jefferson buys it in 1803. And so since the era of the Louisiana Purchase was not part of the United States when the Northwest Ordinance was created in the 1780s, what people who support slavery in Missouri say is that, well, the Northwest Ordinance does not apply to Missouri because Missouri was not part of the United States at that point. It was not a territory. It was actually, owned by France. And it was owned by France until, the United States bought it in 1803. And so, therefore, if they want to have slavery, they ought to be able to. Well, up to this point, one of the things that had muted the disputes over whether slavery ought to be allowed to exist and everything was the fact that there was sort of an equal number of slave and free states up to that point. And so what that means is that no one side could ever really force its viewpoint on the other, because obviously in the Senate they were equal, right? Because each state has 2 votes in the Senate. And so the issue never came up. But people who are anti-slavery, particularly people who live in New England in the North, look at the potential admission of Missouri to the Union and say, whoa, wait a sec, that's going to throw off the balance. Now you'll have 2 more senators from a state that allows slavery, and they therefore can sort of run roughshod over all the rest of us and completely get rid of any restrictions on slavery, bring back the international slave trade, whatever else they want to do. And so the question of admitting Missouri into the Union as a slave state becomes an extremely divisive one on the floor of Congress. I mean, you have people practically coming to fistfights about it. You have the whole business, the whole work of Congress completely grinds to a halt, which is, in this day and age of sort of gridlock in Congress, we're sort of used to that. But at the time, that was not how it worked. And it looks like, in some ways, possibly there might even be civil war, possibly, about the idea of admitting Missouri as a slave state. Into this fight, into this dispute, steps Henry Clay. And in addition to, Jackson's nickname for him, which was the Judas of the West, which we've talked about, Henry Clay had another nickname, which was the Great Compromiser. And the first instance that earned him that nickname was what he did in response to the Missouri Compromise, which is Clay works out a compromise between the sort of anti-slavery forces in Congress and the pro-slavery forces in Congress, which says sort of 3 things, okay? It says that Missouri will be allowed to be admitted to the United States as a slave state, but that the counties of Maine. Okay, Maine is not a state at this point. It's several counties of Massachusetts. Okay, it's actually part of the state of Massachusetts. But that all those counties that are referred to as Maine will now be organized as a state and will enter the Union as a free state. And so therefore you've preserved the balance. There'll be 2 new slave state senators, but there'll be 2 new free state senators. Okay? The other thing that it says, and if you look at the slide that talks about the Missouri Compromise, you can see this line of latitude that corresponds with the southern border of Missouri, which is the 3630 line of latitude. And what it says is that with the exception of Missouri, okay, with the exception of Missouri, which is a slave state, no new states that are formed out of the Louisiana Purchase territory that is north of that line. So this green area that you see on the map there. No new states that are formed north of the 3630 line can be slave states. States that are south of the 3630 line, if you're talking about what eventually became Arkansas and Oklahoma, remember, Texas is not part of the United States yet either. Neither is California or New Mexico or Arizona or Colorado or, part of Colorado is. Stuff that's south of that line can have slavery if they want, if they decide to, but they don't have to. Okay, so the three elements are Missouri becomes a slave state, Maine enters the Union as a free state, and then the 3630 line, which became known as the Missouri Compromise line, is established. And with the exception of Missouri, no new states above that line that are formed out of the territory of the Louisiana Purchase can have slavery. States formed out of the territory from the Louisiana Purchase that are below that line can have slavery. And so this ends it. And for many people in Congress and many writers and people like that, many people think that there will never be another, showdown about slavery because they've solved it, right? We know which new states, depending on where they're formed in relation to the Missouri Compromise line, we know whether they'll be slave or free. Okay? Easy enough. We don't ever have to have this dispute again when a new state applies to be a state, or when a territory applies to be a new state. The problem is what they didn't count on was the annexation of Texas, which adds a whole new area to the United States that had not existed when the Missouri Compromise line was created, and even more so the Mexican War, which at the end of the Mexican War, the United States gains, gains Colorado, or not Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, California, all of those states, which now become in dispute as to whether or not they can have slavery or not because they were not part of the Union when the Missouri Compromise line was created. But for now, at least in 1820, people think that they've dodged the bullet once and for all, and they'll never have to deal with the issue of slavery in a new state and in the territories ever again. But as I mentioned when I talked about the Great Awakening, right, and this takes us to the next slide, the abolition movement. Slavery, people who were opposed to slavery the opposition to slavery had expanded to include particularly religious individuals who were opposed to slavery on religious grounds, but unlike Quakers, were not pacifists, meaning the abolition movement. One of the reform movements that grew out of the Second Great Awakening, in addition to the temperance movement and the and the Sabbatarian movement, was the abolitionist movement, the abolition movement. And the abolition movement was very different than previous movements opposed to slavery, even the Quakers, even though the Quaker opposition to slavery was religiously based. And that is that the abolition movement was an extremely militant movement, was a movement that in many ways advocated violence to end slavery, and was not, it was sort of unequivocal about it. I mean, for example, Quakers would send petitions to Congress saying, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but basically saying, slavery's bad, we don't like it, we would like you to end it. Okay, that's it. Okay, that was sort of all they would do. Whereas abolitionists were much more sort of, fire-breathing, much more angry about it, in some ways threatening violence. And for example, one of the things that's mentioned in the Nat Turner book that you read is David Walker's Appeal, which is written by a free black man in the North who is an abolitionist in 1829. And in David Walker's Appeal, he literally says that, slaves need to not sit around and wait for whites to one day come and free them. Slaves need to take their own freedom. And what he means by that is slaves need to really basically do what it is that Nat Turner did. And that is slaves need to rise up, kill their masters' families, and take their freedom. It is a call to violence. And it is very shocking to people in the South, the idea that there are people located in the North who are calling for slaves to rise up and kill them, to take their freedom. And one of the other sort of leading figures of the abolition movement is this man who appears on the next slide, which is William Lloyd Garrison, who is a Boston minister, congregational minister, who considers slavery to be a sin, and anyone who either allows it to happen or who's involved in it. So not just anybody who's actually holding slaves or selling slaves, but anybody who looks the other way, who doesn't do anything about it. So the entire U.S. government. He considers them to be a sinner and to be condemned to hell. And in 1832, he begins publishing a militant anti-slavery newsletter that you see on the next, or 1831, sorry, that you see on the next slide, called the Liberator. And in the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison refers to the first issue. He says something about, I will not rest, I will not retreat, I will not equivocate, and I will be heard. Meaning I'm not going to play nice. I'm not going to have discussions about slavery. If you support slavery or make excuses for it, then you are a